What's going on, guys, and welcome to This Week in the Shop. And we are back in the basement bar because I found it's a little bit more comfortable here than out in the garage. But it kind of dawned on me about midweek this week at the shop that we had absolutely nothing cool, interesting, or weird really to talk about, and I was worried that I wouldn't have anything to film or talk about. But it then dawned on me that this would be a really good time to talk about something that I've talked about, I think, multiple times on the channel, and that is the multi-air engine. Now, this is, yes, a Fiat engine, but this is in a whole bunch of our Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge stuff, and I guess mainly just in our Jeep and Dodge stuff. Well, I guess Chrysler too. It's literally in everything. This is the 4-cylinder multi-air engine. Now, there has been multiple 4-cylinder engines over the years, but this is the multi-air. This is in Jeep Compasses, Jeep Cherokees, Chrysler 200s, let's see, Dodge Darts, all of that kind of stuff with the 4-cylinder option. It is often that multi-air engine. Some of the older ones were the old 4-cylinder World engine, but this is multi-air that we're going to be talking about today. And again, this is a Fiat engine. Everything under that hood is Fiat. Now, this is kind of a weird, interesting engine, and if you saw from the title, the software update or a recall to fix oil burn. We're going to be talking about that because I think that is such a cool thing that was able to be fixed with a software update. Now, the kind of basis or premise of the multi-air engine is in theory, dual overhead cam 4-cylinder, and yeah, that's like everything. What's the big deal? But there's only one camshaft on a multi-air. There is a exhaust camshaft, a traditional camshaft with lobes and what have you. The intake camshaft, it's not a camshaft. It is an electronic, hydraulic, oil-fed, solenoid-powered brick is what we call it. It's this big metal brick that bolts in place where an intake camshaft would be. Now, there are 4 different solenoids, electronic solenoids, that have electrical connectors going into them that basically control when those intake valves are open, closed, the duration, the lift, all of that stuff controlled with an electronic solenoid. Now, what controls or what actually powers those valves to open and close are oil. There is oil pressure that is fed or produced off of the exhaust camshaft that rolls another set of lifters, or excuse me, another set of lobes onto that multi-air brick, which feeds oil pressure to those intake valve assemblies. It sounds very complicated, and I guess it kind of is compared to just a traditional camshaft, but the kind of cool thing about that is you are able to, again, control lift, control valve duration, control if a valve's even going to be open at any time. So it's kind of cool. You can have, you know, Honda has variable valve, or excuse me, their VTEC. You know, everybody has different variable valve timing or lift. This thing can do all of it with that intake cam. Now, our exhaust cam, again, is a traditional camshaft, and you can't really control anything there. It's just opening those valves with lobes. Now, when the multi-air engine came out in our Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, Fiat products, we had some growing pains with them. We had a whole bunch of engines burning oil. Now, typically, yes, any engine, depending on miles, condition, how the engine's been treated, is going to burn or use some oil. Whether we've got oil going past the piston rings, or we've got oil burning from the valve stem seals, or there's a plethora of different reasons a engine can use oil. Through the PCV valve system is another common example. We would find these multi-air engines very, very young coming into the dealership, being very low on oil, and we couldn't really determine what the cause was. We would put PCV valves, we would, you know, there was just a number of things we would try and do, but they would always seem to come back with low engine oil, and it was just kind of the untold thing when you'd do oil changes on a multi-air engine. You'd kind of add an extra half quart or so to hopefully help that vehicle make it to its next oil change, because at the time the oil change intervals were 12 months or 10,000 miles, which is kind of a long interval for any darn engine, and definitely an engine that was using and burning oil. Now, in the owner's manual, there's a paragraph that would blatantly state at each fuel fill up to check and add oil as needed. And unfortunately, we would often reference that to customers that were coming in with oil burn issues, and they were not happy to hear that. They were not happy to hear that their brand new Jeep Cherokee with the 4-cylinder, they needed to add and check oil as often as they did. I do recall a Dodge Dart customer that was not having it. They were angry, they were mad, they demanded a repair. The technician then got an engine approved, because obviously we've got some sort of engine issue, something like that. Replaced the engine, and the new engine burned oil identically to the original engine that came out of the vehicle. So there wasn't really a fix. No matter what we did, whether that was engine replacement, replacing parts and pieces and what have you, nothing changed it, and they all burned oil. Right up until there was a recall that came out for the multi-air 4-cylinder engines, and that recall was for oil consumption, and the repair of all things was a software update. Now you might be going, well, hold on, how are you fixing an engine mechanical issue with a software update? But it wasn't a mechanical issue, it was a software valve issue. What was finally told to us and described is the intake valves, again, are those controlled solenoid driven valves, were closing at highway speeds when you were off throttle. Now, let me explain that. You're driving down the road at 60 miles an hour. You pull your foot off of the throttle to coast, to exit for an off ramp, to just decelerate as you would. The intake valves would be commanded to stay closed or partially closed or reduce the amount of lift or whatever the actual programming was. When those valves would close and the engine is still turning, the fact that we've got intake valves closed, we've got pistons moving and exhaust valves moving, we were creating a vacuum in the combustion chamber, and the pistons were dragging oil up the cylinder walls from the oil pan from the crankcase area, coating the cylinder walls, and then the next time the exhaust valve opened, we were shooting the oil, we were burning the oil with the spark plug, with what have you, and burning that oil at a rapid pace. Now, this kind of helped us to understand why the oil burn issue was so varying depending on the vehicle. Some would come in burning a ton of oil, some wouldn't burn any oil. It was just really wild to know or to see which ones were using oil and which ones weren't. But once that explanation came out on the oil burn, that made perfect sense. The vehicles that were driven a lot at highway speeds and then again let off throttle to exit for off ramps were going to be the ones that burned an exceptional amount of oil versus the ones that were just driven around in town. If you're just doing stop and go driving at city speeds, you're probably not going to be burning engine oil. So again, the recall came out to perform a engine computer software update, and that changed the intake valve strategy. So basically, instead of it closing those intake valves, creating vacuum, pulling oil up the cylinder walls, you just had the valves work like they're supposed to work, and wow, imagine that, we are not burning oil now. So again, I always liked doing that recall. It was kind of a fun recall to, again, do the software update, and Chrysler wanted you to check the engine oil and add as necessary. If it was a quart low, you dumped a quart of oil. If it was 2 quarts low, you dumped 2 quarts. I had some come in that were 3 and 4 quarts low on your 5.5 quart system. Now that kind of leads to the next thing of, man, if that thing was burning oil, couldn't you have killed a bunch of engines? And fortunately for the multi-air engine, you can't really kill those things. And you might be going, well, what are you talking about? You run an engine low, it's going to die. But Let's go back to what we initially talked about. The intake valves are controlled with oil. If we don't have any oil in the oil pan or very low oil, those intake valves cannot open, which means the engine can't run. So vehicles would be driven until they were low enough on oil. You would often find them come into the dealership dying while turning because that few quarts of oil remaining in the oil pan, you would take a corner, the oil would slosh away from the oil pickup in the oil pan, and then the intake valves couldn't continue to open, which would result in the vehicle shutting off. You would coast over to the side of the road, the oil would drain back into the oil pan, and then they would fire up and run. So you couldn't really kill them because the engine wouldn't stay running long enough for bearing damage to occur because they would just shut off while driving. Now, yes, multiple times they were driven or towed into the dealership, again, dying. We would then do an oil change, get them full of oil, and they would be perfectly fine. Again, this was prior to the recall coming out. So it was a pretty wild time before the recall, before the software update came out to fix the multi-air engines. And it's always kind of a fun story explaining to people how a software update fixed a mechanical issue, an oil consumption issue on an engine, because that's weird. Now, other issues that we often see with the multi-air, like we said, we talked about you can't really kill them because they run out of oil. The oil gets low enough, the intake valves won't open. That multi-air brick, that big electronic, hydroelectronic, oil-fed thing, that thing occasionally, like any electronic device, can go bad. There are 4 solenoids on the back of that thing. If one of those solenoids go bad, there are not individually replaceable parts for those. It is the whole multi-air brick, again, as we call it, and that thing is real expensive. If I recall, that thing is like $1,400 or $1,000. I don't recall offhand. Again, I'm normally the guy just bolting the parts on, fixing the vehicles, but that thing is 4 digits for sure on that multi-air brick. Again, it's not too bad. You're pulling the valve cover off. You are then putting a special holding fixture on the brick, unbolting it, taking it off, installing the new, clearing the codes, and you are then typically good to go. But it's been kind of an interesting motor, and it was always funny because all of us technicians would always advise people, stay away from the multi-air. It is bad, don't buy it, they burn oil, there's nothing we can do. Now that the recall software update came out, all of those issues are gone. Yes, you could still have a gotcha with the multi-air brick, but for the most part, we all tell people, or when people ask us Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge technicians, hey, would you buy a multi-air? Yeah, why not? They're a little underpowered. They aren't the biggest power plant in the lineup, but there's nothing wrong with them now. Now, pending they've got their software update done, I would have no reason to tell someone not to buy a multi-air engine. So keep that in mind. Obviously, this recall came out years and years ago. This is nothing new. This is not new information. I just wanted to be able to sit down and talk to you guys about a weird engine and a weird repair that we got to do over the years on the Fiat multi-air engine. Now, last but not least, another Fiat multi-air engine recall, which doesn't really have anything to do with the actual engine, but catalytic converters. We, of recent, the last year or so, had a new recall for the multi-air engine equipped vehicles, certain obviously build date, build range, for the catalytic converters. Now, catalytic converters often get recalled for different reasons. Obviously, normally it's for catalyst efficiency codes. They aren't cleaning the exhaust as good as they should. There's a recall issued and then they get replaced. Unfortunately, for the multi-air engine, that is a maniverter style catalytic converter. That's where our catalytic converter is built onto the exhaust manifold. So that whole assembly needs to get replaced, which is fine for the customer because a recall doesn't cost you anything other than a little inconvenience in time. But what we found on the multi-air engines, those exhaust manifold bolts don't come out very well. We've got a steel exhaust manifold bolting onto our aluminum head with some steel bolts. And what we found, those steel bolts gall or seize or make themselves one with that intake, or excuse me, with that cylinder head, and they come out very, very poorly. Half the time they are pulling all the threads, and the other half of the time the bolts are breaking off in the cylinder head. Now, Chrysler, for the recall, came out with this big fancy fixture that you bolt on after the exhaust manifold is removed that has different dies, different taps, so you can drill out these broken bolts, you can tap the hole, helicoil it. It's kind of a massive mess, and you are often breaking off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bolts in the cylinder heads and doing a whole lot of drilling. My Milwaukee drill has gotten a workout on these darn recalls, but once you get them drilled out, tapped out, helicoiled, the recall comes with all brand new hardware, a new manifold, a new gasket, you bolt it on, and then oddly enough, you do another software update. So even if we didn't catch you for the first recall for the oil consumption, we'll get you this time here and get your vehicle up to date. So again, guys, just wanted to go through a really weird, wacky engine, wacky recall, wacky fix for something that you wouldn't typically fix with a software update if it wasn't a goofy, weird valve train controlled with electronic timing with, you know, those oil-fed electronic solenoids. So guys, hopefully you found this interesting. Even if you don't have a multi-air 4-cylinder engine out in your garage, you can at least go, man, that is really weird and really goofy. So guys, thanks for coming down into the basement again with me here on this episode of This Week in the Shop. And we've got a few videos finally filmed now that we are warmed up out in the garage. We did a little Jeep work yesterday, and we finally filmed a review on the brand new vehicle that's out in the garage, a brand new Wagoneer S of all things. So get ready for those, hopefully to come out beginning of this coming week. And then we'll keep on going now that it is warm, guys. So like I always say, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.